An excellent way to study the Bible, not the only way, is to read it asking as many questions as one can think of about it and trying to answer them all. The questions can be about concepts, motivations, obscure words and phrases, moral objections, and so on. The questions can be both devotional as well as critical. I used to read philosophy in college and graduate school following something like this method. Now, beginning in 2021 and until 2023, for my own benefit, I studied the book of Genesis this way. I ended up writing over 300,000 words of questions and answers. My comments on the first 11 chapters of Genesis are relatively lightweight, I would say. I was feeling my way toward how I wanted to study the material. By the time I had gotten to chapter 12, however, I was getting farther into the depth I would use for the rest of the book. Experimentally, then, I will begin reading and discussing the questions and answers that I wrote, beginning today with chapter 12, verse 1 of Genesis, in which God first calls to Abram, who will later be renamed Abraham. And let's begin by simply reading the verse. It goes like this: Now the Lord had said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. That's all there is. And I've got quite a few questions to ask about this. So I'm going to not simply read through my own text. I'm going to try to explain what's going on, because I think I have pitched it at a somewhat high level. So I'm going to sort of explain myself explaining the Bible. So the first question is it not odd that the Lord is reported as simply making a speech to Abram? Did Abram even know who he was? So the problem here, if you want to consider it a problem, is the fact that God just speaks out of the blue. Now, Abram himself had been introduced in the previous chapter, but here he is speaking out of the blue to Abram. We're not told that God had in any way introduced himself to Abram. And so the question is, did Abram know who God or Yahweh was, or Elohim? Now, I'm going to gloss over the differences between those names, or at least right now, and because that doesn't really enter into the discussion that I want to have on a certain point. So here we go. So we discussed earlier in comments on Genesis 11:26 above that Abram's future grandnephew, Laban, will later say that Elohim was the God of his grandfather, Nahor, and his great-grandfather, Terah, quote, the God of Abraham and the God of Nahor, the God of their father, judge betwixt us, unquote. Genesis 31:53. So the interesting thing here is that Elohim, which means essentially God, it is translated God in virtually all English translations, is called the God of Nahor and his great-grandfather Terah. Now, Terah was the father of Abraham. So let's get clear. On the one hand, this might mean there was a continuous tradition of worshiping a single God, Elohim, the creator of the universe, in Terah's family. In other words, in the father of Abraham's family. On the other hand, that might not be correct because the plural judge, the plural verb judge, not singular, judges, might imply that Laban was referring to a plural number of gods. So you have to look back at the verse we're talking about now. It says, the God of Abraham and the God of Nahor, the God of their father, judge betwixt us. Now the word judge here is plural, and that means that it seems to imply that multiple gods are being referred to. And so Laban was referring to a plural number of gods. Still, the fact that God speaks to Abram and that Abram instantly obeys would seem to imply that he, Elohim, needed no introduction. Why would he here, meaning Abram, why would Abram so instantly obey the call of a totally unknown God? And how would he be able to persuade or compel his family, not just his wife, but his nephew as well, because Laban is about to come with him? Besides, knowledge of the Lord, it seems, would have been common, because there was, according to the Bible, a living memory of the flood and its reason. So if you analyze the years given in Genesis 11:10 to 26, Noah was still alive at this time. The latter point is underscored by the fact that there are others, such as Melchizedek, the priest king of Salem, who worshipped the Lord, Yahweh. The name is used in Genesis 14:11, and also he's worshipped by Job, who seems unrelated to Abram. In other words, the point is that the worship of Elohim, or Yahweh, is attributed to not just Abram. It wasn't introduced by Abram. It was introduced before that, again, according to the Bible. The bottom line is actually fairly simple. The reason why Abram is not shown being introduced to the Lord is that Abram was already familiar with him according to what is implied, not stated, but implied by the Bible. And this is a very, very important point to bear in mind as you read the Bible. You cannot understand what's going on unless you ask questions and make inferences. In fact, there is so much that seems to be more or less taken for granted in the reader's understanding of the text that I think it's fairly clear that the way that it was written, it was assumed that whoever did read it had thoroughly absorbed and explored the implications of what is on the page. All right, let's move on to the next question and answer. This is much shorter. The text says simply, "Now the Lord had said unto Abram," without saying anything about the form in which he appeared. Previously, God spoke directly to Adam, Cain, and Noah. How then would Moses' audience have understood this? Now, there are two options. One is that he appeared in some bodily form, in what is called a theophany, a physical appearance, or a visible, anyway, appearance, as in Genesis 18, as we will see. The second is that Abram heard the voice of God, or silently apprehended, as in a dream or a prophetic vision, the thoughts of God. But Acts 7:2 has a reference to this incident. It says, quote, "The God of glory appeared," unquote, to Abram, and that straightforwardly confirms the first. In other words, God made some either bodily theophanic appearance or some other sort of visual appearance to Abram. Next question. When was it that the Lord said, quote, "Get out of thy country," unquote, and therefore, which country is meant? The question is simply, when in verse 1 God said, "Get thee out of thy country," did he mean Ur of the Chaldees or Haran? Because there's evidence of both. I think what I need to add is that at the end of Genesis 11, in verse 28, it says, "And Haran," this is the father of Lot, his name was Haran, the same as the place, "died before his father Terah in the land of his nativity in Ur of the Chaldees." So this is getting very complicated, isn't it? And then at the end of the chapter, it says, "Terah took Abram his son and others, and they went forth with them from Ur of the Chaldees." In other words, they had been living there, "to go into the land of Canaan, and they came unto Haran and dwelt there." In other words, they had intended to press on to Canaan, which is basically where Israel is now. And but they didn't make it all the way. They stopped at Haran. This is really what raises the question when God says to Abram, "Get thee out of thy country," which country did he mean, and when did he call him? This is a bit of a puzzle, and it's a very interesting puzzle, and it takes some time to get through. The Lord could have said this in and meant by thy country either Ur of the Chaldees, as it is called, or Haran. It is possible, so I guess I should explain where those are. Ur was in lower Mesopotamia, in southern Iraq, close to Kuwait, I guess, whereas Haran was basically northern Syria, southern Turkey, I think, up in that region anyway. The quite a ways northwest of Ur. So it is possible, since for various reasons the biblical narrative can skip around, that Ur is actually meant. In other words, even though it has just been reported in chapter 11 that the family moved to Haran, the call to Abraham, or rather the call to Abram, might nevertheless have been made to him while he was still in Ur. One reason to think so is that in Genesis 15:7, God will say, quote, "I am the Lord that brought thee out of Ur of the Chaldees," unquote, implying that Abram was called out of Ur. Now, it is also perfectly consistent with all relevant texts from Genesis 11, 12, and 15 that Haran was meant. Perhaps Abram simply went away from Ur with Terah out of filial duty, or because the Elamites had invaded and destroyed Ur. which is something that I have discussed earlier in these notes. Perhaps when the Lord first spoke to Abraham, the family had lived in Haran long enough for that to be, quote, thy country, unquote. Or perhaps it was formerly Terah's homeland. There is some evidence of this discussed earlier in the notes again. That God would accurately describe Haran as thy country. In that case, God would have intentionally brought Abram out of Ur while calling him out of Haran. Still, if we aim to accept the Christian Bible in its totality, the former interpretation must be the correct one, because at Acts 7, verses 2 to 3, we have, quote, the God of glory appeared unto our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he dwelt in Charan, or Haran, and said unto him, get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred, and come into the land which I shall show thee. Unquote. Since the latter statement of God's is almost a perfect quote of Genesis 12:1, clearly, Luke is offering a definitive interpretation of precisely the question at issue. God originally called Abram and even appeared to him not from Haran, but from Ur, and thus thy country was indeed Ur. Interestingly, different interpretations of 12 verse 1 appear to take positions on the question. So the KJV and NIV both say, now the Lord had said, which is pluperfect. That is, before this point in the narrative, so presumably at Ur, while NASB and ASV both say, now the Lord said, which is the perfect tense, that is, at this point in the narrative, while at Haran. All right, so I apologize for the complexity here, and to clarify a bit, again, I just want to emphasize that in Acts chapter 7, the text says, the God of glory appeared unto Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he dwelt in Haran, and then said unto him the words of Genesis 12:1. So that makes it clear that if you accept the Christian Bible in its totality, then you're essentially committed to the notion that Abram was called out of Ur, not Haran, even though he started his journey away from his father from Haran. And when he returned to his family later, he returned to Haran. Now, there is one other thing to say on this, and that is, again, I know there are some commentators who reject the exegetical principle that interpretive issues of this sort are to be settled by consulting the Bible in its entirety. That is an exegetical principle that I accept for the common and I think rather obvious reason that if you think the Bible is inspired by God, that God is not going to contradict himself as he inspires different writers to comment on what has happened or what is going to happen. So, one more question. Why might God specify that Abram go, quote, out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house, unquote? One might well say because God's plan was to start a new country in the future Israel, which happened to lie far away from his relations. But other known details suggest there was more to it than this. For one thing, as we've already discussed, Abram's family worshipped the other gods. At least it certainly looks that way. Possibly the gods of the Chaldeans, since they lived in Ur for some time at least, in addition to the Lord. Or perhaps they worshipped gods of Haran. In modern times, a temple of the moon goddess called Sin, yes, that was her name, was discovered in what is supposed to be the land of Haran. Anyway, the influences on this new people, the descendants of Abram, must be entirely independent of such pagan roots. Beyond that, we might bear in mind that Jesus, too, told his followers that they might have to abandon their families in order to follow the Lord most faithfully. Although, to be clear, this was never made a general rule, of course, and often one family member converts all the rest. Moreover, and more to the point, we have here the first injunction to the first Hebrews to make themselves separate and holy.